the difference between the call traffic we saw prior to 2020 and the call traffic that we've seen for the last 2 years is most of that call traffic never made it to an agent. And I think a lot of you probably know there are some techniques being developed now where if you're on hold for quite some time, or there's going to be a long hold time, a lot of organizations are now saying, rather than be on hold, let us call you back when we're available. But that's certainly working on the organization schedule and not the customer schedule. And so a lot of traffic was stuck in the IVR, and it's a great playground for fraudsters to play in for a number of reasons. But we'll get into today a little bit about the case for better self-service. In talking to a lot of our customers and people in the industry, there is a push to increase the customer flow into mobile apps, into online banking, into the IVR, and have customers self-service where they can. And the IVR is a really great spot for that. But there are challenges to that. And we'll talk a little bit about what those challenges are and whether or not you can overcome those challenges. So increased self-service options, all channels. We'll talk a little bit about benefits to organizations by increasing that service. We'll talk about the obstacles that exist today. We'll talk about the ID and V process and why that's so important. And we'll talk about identifying high risk and fraudulent activity. And so both of these are really, really important. 98% of the callers that are calling into a call center today are good customers. And so the fraud lies within that 1 or 2%, maybe as high as 3% of fraudulent or call center activity. And so when we take a look at why are we treating 97% of the good customers in hopes that we'll catch maybe 0.5%, maybe 0.25% of the bad guys that exist in that remaining 3%? And what can we do to make sure that we're not opening ourselves up to fraud exposure by not being able to identify the high risk activity as we're authenticating good customers in the IVR. So increased self-service options. So there's a lot of great things and great reasons why organizations want to do this. Number one, they can service very large amount of customers and they don't have to spend a whole lot of money to do it. They don't need that increased staff. Handling calls can be very expensive. So handling cost, handling capacity. I'll give you an example of capacity. We have one customer today that handles probably at the agent leg of the call, about 700,000 calls per month. And in 2020, at its peak, when branches were shut down and financial stimulus was coming out, and PPP loans were coming out, and all these monetary transactions, they were getting 700,000 calls every single day. And there was no way with the capacity and the shift to work from home that they could handle these callers. So hold times were long. Their abandonment rate was somewhere in the neighborhood of 85% of those callers never got serviced and probably had to call back repeated number of times before they could get service. That has become the new normal. Here in the States, I'm keeping track of a lot of the customers that we work with and a lot of the financials, and they're closing branches that were open 2 years ago, right? They're shrinking their footprint in the physical space, and they're moving towards self-service options. It's much cheaper and it's much more efficient. And when we talk to our customers last year and the year before and doing roundtables or our advisory board, which is made up of our customers, 77% of those customers plan to enhance IVR usage in the next 6 to 18 months. Many are already there, and a lot of them are halfway down that path. The benefits they get from that, obviously customer satisfaction. There's no long hold times. There's no waiting for a call back, and the customer can self-service and do the things they need to do very quickly in the IVR. If the call has to go to an agent, there is significantly reduced average handle time. By authenticating or pre-authenticating customers in the IVR, you can reduce 1, 2, 3 KBA questions that are currently being asked today. We have customers today that have been on our authentication product. They don't ask any questions when the call goes to an agent. So that's pretty amazing. It took them some time to get there. I'm not going to lie. It's an uncomfortable thing. We've been so used to calling into call centers and being asked 2, 3, 4 questions to identify and authenticate against that data. And so some of their customers called in and said, why aren't you asking me any questions? And we already know who you are based on your device and your voice and behavior. We don't have to. We know who you are. we're ready to get to business. And so we have a number of customers today, don't ask any more questions at the agent leg of the call. That's an amazing customer satisfaction boost. Call routing, first call resolution, calls get to where they quickly need to go by identifying and authenticating in the IVR. You know this customer, you know what service needs they have, and that can get to the right rep very, very quickly. If it's a fraud call, it shouldn't even go to the call center rep, right? If you've identified that this is a bad guy calling in and that call exits out to an agent, exit it to a fraud inbound team. Don't exit it out to the team that's handling good customer requests. And enhanced CSR satisfaction, or whatever you call them, customer service reps, customer service agents. One of the things when we rolled out authentication that we heard back from our customers is like the staff that's taking these phone calls that don't have to ask these questions anymore. And some of those questions are a little clunky, whether they're KBAs or step up auth. They are so happy they don't have to ask the customer these questions repeatedly over and over and over again. We actually work with one financial institution that was asking as much as 8 questions on every call. And so, I can't even imagine calling into a bank and being asked to verify with 8 questions. That's a huge customer dissatisfier, but it's also a huge employee dissatisfier as well. And so employees are ecstatic that they don't have to do this as a part of their process anymore. So what obstacles exist? And this is kind of where the rubber meets the road. Without a strong ID&V process or the ability to authenticate calls or accounts in the IVR, you can be opening yourself up to some severe exposure. You definitely have to have a multi-factor authentication approach needed. Static questions, the frauds, we all know, we're all fraud professionals. They know the answers to these questions. If you're asking what the date of birth, what the zip code, what the address is, they're going to answer those with ease. And if they don't have the answers to those, they will go back and get those answers, and they'll just simply call back in. And so metadata about an account or an identity simply just doesn't work anymore. And so it's got to be multi-factor. It's got to include that metadata information, but it also has to include the person's voice, the person's device, and the person's behavior as well. All of these things are really, really important when you're segregating between good call traffic. Again, 96, 97% of the time it's good. Bad call traffic can be as high as 1%. And you always have a little bit of a pocket in the middle where you're capturing calls and you're enrolling calls. And until you can get a good enrollment, they're not going to fall on either side of that. They're kind of in the middle, and you treat them with normal business practices. And trust. Do you trust the process that's in place? I've yet to come across any financial institution or insurance company that would allow a customer to perform a very high risk, high dollar transaction in the IVR. It will come, but it's got to come along with trust. So will you allow your customers to do some of what we would consider to be moderate to high risk account activity in the IVR? You'll do that once you have you're fairly certain and fairly positive that your authentication practice is indeed identifying good customers and not allowing fraudsters to enroll and take advantage of your IVR. So that's the major obstacle today. I think most customers feel pretty confident that they can put in some authentication pieces, but where they kind of fall short is, how do we really determine high risk and fraudulent activity? And so multi-factor, absolutely the way to go. So let's talk about the identification and the authentication process. So identification and authentication, to me, they're 2 separate processes. When I think about identification, I'm thinking about who I am, what my name is, what my date of birth is. That identifies who I am as a person. All of that metadata we were talking about before. Authenticating me, that's a different process. And so when the caller calls into the call center, one of the things that we ask, are you able to trust who is calling because they have the answers to the test, they have the answers to the questions that you're asking? What other data points are you using to authenticate this is my genuine caller? Because there's a number of people out there that know my zip code, that know where I live, that know my date of birth. And so whether it's family fraud, whether it's third-party fraud and account takeover, this information is readily available. And we see more and more where The genuine customer usually is the first phone call from the fraudster. So they're calling your account holders. They're getting this information from them, pretending to be you. And then they simply just call you with all the right answers. And so that's identification. Who am I dealing with? Let me get that information and pull up that account. But how do you truly authenticate them? And there's three processes that I call out here on this slide that I think are very, very important. Active versus passive. When we talk about active versus passive, talking about, does your customer have to actively enroll in the enrollment process? And so do they have to say a catchphrase 3, 4, 5 times? Do they have to opt in? Are there a number of different things they have to do to opt in? Passive takes no additional work from your customers, and it significantly increases the enrollment percentage. Of course, you can always have a customer opt out if they don't want to, but what we found works best is that you opt them in and allow them to opt out should they choose to not enroll. But again, we capture the call, we capture the voice. If there's voice in the IVR, that's fantastic. If you don't have voice in your IVR yet, that's okay. We can do it at the agent leg as well. It takes a minimal amount of net speech along with all of our risk engines and all of our authentication engines to go ahead and enroll the natural net speech that's already happening on the call. We'll use that to enroll. And oftentimes that's a lot better to use their natural speaking voice than to prompt them with things that they have to say over and over and over again. Low risk. Low risk simply means that when you start day 0, you have no customers that are enrolled in your authentication process. So you don't have a behavior yet, you don't have the device yet, you don't have the voice yet. That's all being captured on call number 1. However, most calls, like I said, are very low risk. And so on the very first call, before they've had a chance to enroll, you have the opportunity to look at the risk factors associated with that call and enhance that experience on the very first call, prior to any enrollment, prior to any future calls. Everything after that first call is a bonus because they're already enrolled and you're going to see full authentication savings. But in some organizations, you may have customers that call in once every 3 months, once every 6 months. And so the track to get to 40, 50, 60% of all your callers being enrolled and authenticated can take 3, 6, 9 months. And so you can supplement that full profile authentication with low risk authentication. And the third piece of this is anti-validation. Do you trust that the anti's calling hasn't been spoofed? Do you trust that the call is coming from the device that owns the number? And that's a very important piece in our risk engines. And so we can generally remove 85% of the calls that are going to validate. And when I say validate, we look at a lot of the signaling that's coming through, the SIP signaling coming through has a lot of indicators in it that tell us that the call is routing as it should for that device type, for that phone number. And so when it gets to the carrier and the carrier passes us that information, we take a look at the OLI and the JIP and the trunk and header and switch information. And that tells us this call is validated. It is traveling the right path. If it was spoofed, it would have taken a very different path for that carrier's cell phone, that carrier's landline, that carrier's VoIP. And so we can trust the device and we can trust that the anti-calling has not been spoofed. Very, very important to have all 3 of these in place in a successful process. Identifying high risk and fraudulent activity is the flip side of that coin. And so using the IVR in combination with other channels helps the fraudster get around a bunch of your security controls. It's cross channels, omni-channel blind spots where fraudsters can exploit the information they're getting from your IVR to go downstream into the cards channel, to go into the online channel, to go into the mobile app channel. They very well may stick in the call center. They might go to an agent. It's not often. The fraudsters we see at the agent leg of the call, those are fraudsters have all the information they need. They're ready to cash out now. The fraudsters we see in the IVR have a little bit different of a behavior. These oftentimes are the fraudsters that are gathering information, building out credentials, will oftentimes sell those credentials to another fraudster who will then monetize the account if they don't have the ability to do it. So when you think about those fraud types, you think about account reconnaissance, and they're verifying that the account is in good status. They're verifying an account balance. They're verifying what kind of identifiers are being asked. So they're doing reconnaissance. You probably don't know they're doing this because they stay in the IVR. Oftentimes we've seen when they get kicked out of the IVR, they simply disconnect the call and call right back in. We also see a lot of bot activity happening in the IVR as well. Fraudsters that have the ability to set up a bot to just go ahead and plug in account numbers and grab account balances. It makes their process very, very efficient if they can automate. The interesting thing about the account reconnaissance piece is it is an early warning signal that fraud is going to happen on this account. And I'll clarify that. Fraud's probably not going to happen if there's $10 in the account, if there's $50 in the account. But as they go through and do the account reconnaissance and they realize that, hey, this account status is active and the balance is $50,000 or $10,000 or $5,000, they're ready to jump on that, go ahead and sell off that credential for a fraudster to monetize. So oftentimes, when I say it's an early indicator of fraud that's going to happen, post that reconnaissance activity, we see an attempt to monetize can be 10, 20, 30, 40, even up to 60 to 90 days out. And so they get their reconnaissance, they know the account's good, they know it's active, they know there's a $10,000 open to buy, they sell that credential, that fraudster then takes that credential, 20 days later, you have a fraud event in your credit card line of business, in your debit card line of business, attempts happening online. So the omni-channel approach to this is using the IVR intelligence downstream and other controls, along with some unique account type information that would help you understand when that fraud's going to happen and put you in a better position to prevent it. And, if I gave you a list of accounts and said fraud's going to happen in the next 30 days on these accounts, or there's a high chance probability that it's going to happen on these accounts in the next 30 days, you'd take that information gladly and take a closer look at those accounts. You may even take a look at some of those accounts and say, there's a lot of exposure here. Let's go ahead and lock this account down, get it resecured, and back to active status for the customer. So the monetization, it can still happen in the call center. We see that happening about 10% of the time. 90% of the time, it's going to a different channel, but they're using the IVR to gather that intelligence. So identifying that is super, super important, because the more functionality you put, increasing that self-service option for the customer, that's all self-service functionality for the fraudster as well. And if you're asking very basic questions to identify and not multi-factor authentication, you're really opening yourself up to, well, now the fraudster never has to talk to an agent. They don't have to go to another channel. They can just transact on these accounts in the IVR. So you got to have confidence that you're authenticating your good customers and trust in that process. And you also have to have a process in place to identify and pull out that high risk activity before it can cause you fraud losses down the road. So I just want to recap. Increase self-service options. This is happening at a number of different organizations, probably within your organization as well. If I had to guess, if you're a financial institution of some sort, insurance, retail, they are all making a ton of self-service options available in virtually every channel they can. There are huge benefits to doing that. Increased self-service in the IVR specifically, and we're in the call center space, but there's also huge benefits to enhancing self-service options online and in apps and whatnot. And so maybe even voice connected devices. And we have a couple customers today that are embedding voice into their apps, embedding the voice into those devices so that they have authentication by voice within their tools. But there are a lot of cost benefits. There are a lot of customer satisfaction benefits from increasing service in the IVR and those other channels. But there are obstacles that exist today. You have to trust in the authentication process, and you can only do that if it's multi-factor. And you also have to have a way to identify the high risk and fraudulent activity. And the last two pieces of this were some best practices from the field, from customers that use this today, that have to have these things in that process. They're must-haves, and they also have must-haves in identifying high risk and fraudulent activity as well.